Well, welcome to Clarkdale Historical Society of Museums presentation by Vincent Randall, our Legacy Award winner. For January the 6th, 2022, he will be presenting a very unique and, in a lot of ways, unknown story about one of the citizens of Clarkdale and also a Native American. So we're honored again to have Vincent here, and Nathan is our our video photographer, and anyway, thank you. You can take your mask off,
right? Greetings to all, and Happy New Year, 2022. Today, there's a subject that isn't the best subject, but it's something that happened in Clarkdale that pertains to Clarkdale history, which I will share with you today. The story begins really back when I was a small boy, growing up, and my mother always talked about a mass. The way she said it was a mass killing, and she always pointed to the spot where it happened. She never really talked about who was involved, who did it. But she did say that some of the people that were killed were of the family, the Beauties. And today, we have descendants of the Beauties on the Middle Verde Reservation that used to live mostly in Clarkdale. But their roots go back to Clear Creek. Because they were half Apaches and half Yavapais. When you read the documents, it talks about Mojave Apaches. And when they do that, most of the time, they are Yavapais. But a lot of times they will say Apache Mojave. And when they do that, it seems to be that the person had both tribes in blood, so to say. And that's how Justin Head, who is the main character in the story today, is listed as an Apache Mojave. So he was half, and the Beauties were half Apaches and half Yavapais. So anyway, my mom used to tell us about the killings and the murders, really, what happened. And geographically, we did a field reconnoiter, I guess you could call it, with Mr. Jim Gamble filming. And there should be a film on the location on where this happened. But basically, today we have a new trailer court down there on your way to Cottonwood. And there's a gap in a hill that the road cuts through today. But back in the old days, it went over the top. And on the right-hand side, on top of that hill, is where the event took place. So anyway, for years, that's about what I knew of that there was some killings. I never knew who did it. I did know the family that did get shot up. Then, as the years went by, I'd say probably eight years ago, Steve Ayers, who was at that time working for the Verde Independent, came by my office at Camp Verde because I work as the manager of Apache Cultural Preservation for the Yavapai Apache Nation. And we had been trading notes before about historical events because he likes history and so forth. So anyway, he came by one day and he asked me about some murders taking place. Did you ever hear anything about that? And so in our discussion, I told him about what my mom had said all these years. And so anyway, that lit the flame, so to say, of interest on both sides, both Steve's side and my side. We began to start our research and begin to find out exactly, see what happened. And so during our search, we began to find out that the person that did the murder was a Apache Yavapai by the name of Justin Head. And this is a picture of Justin that took place there. I've done other talks here and talked about how when the Yavapais and Apaches came back to Clarkdale, they settled down here on where the old smelter site used to be. And when Clark came in to build his smelter, he more or less chased the people out of there. And the people, the Yavapai descent, moved west, which is now the Clarkdale Yavapai Apache Reservation. The Apaches moved south. And so the Beauty family must have been more, to me, they were Apaches from the matrilineal side, because we trace our ancestry through the mother side. So their mother and grandmother and so forth, on the lady side, they must have been Apaches because they moved down dead south, and so that's where they were living, up there on top of the hill. And from the different articles that have been written, this one's from the miner, that's Jerome Miner, tells about the incident. And I guess they were drinking what we call home brew, which is a drink that's made from corn. It's a very low alcohol content, but if you drink enough, then it affects you. But according to the stories that we garnered out of the articles, was that Mr. Head was not only drinking the home brew, but also, according to one article, he's drinking some whiskey. So he shows up at the camp, up there on top of that hill, and basically gets in an argument. And according to his side of the story is that he used a Winchester, and to defend himself, he killed 3 people. Now, there were 5 people that were shot. According to Justin Head, he did 3 of them. And he says that the other 2 were from the other people involved, the Beauties and so forth, that with their shooting, they killed the other 2. So a total of 5 people died that day. Now, my mother used to say that this took place around 1905. According to this one article that I have here from the miner, this took place in 1906, right around November, towards the end of November. And so anyway, the shooting took place, and boom, we had 5 people that were dead. And so then we pick up the story as we recounted and asked people that Justin then took off and headed down to Camp Verde. And at that time, in Camp Verde, it hadn't, there was only there really wasn't any Indian land per se. There were just Indian camps there. And this is because in 1906, there was no land yet. And the man that helped get land for the people at that time hadn't come yet, which was Mr. Taylor Gabbard. He didn't come until 1907. So if it was in 1906, then there were quite a few, both Yavapais and Apaches, that had left San Carlos from their concentration camp and had moved back into the Camp Verde area. And most of them were living around the salt mines and other areas like Beaver Creek. And wherever they could find a piece of land, they could stay for a while. So anyway, he took off and headed in that direction. In the meantime, the people were very clannish, were awfully clannish and related with each other. And definitely our system of justice is really the biblical eye for an eye. And so, according to Justin, as he took off and ran off to Camp Verde, we have a communication system we call the moccasin telegraph. It moves very fast. So word got out real quick that Justin had been involved with some shootings. And since everybody is related to each other and being clannish, and an eye for an eye is justice, they formed more or less, I guess you would call a posse, and were beginning to go after him. In the meantime, in Camp Verde, there was a policeman, and I don't know how that happened. This is pre-reservation days, but evidently, I see written in the records there was a guy named George Williams, who is a policeman, a former scout. And he tries to head him off. And as he sobered up and got to Camp Verde, word had also reached Camp Verde, and the relatives were all ready and armed to go after Justin. So Justin, fearing for his life, came back to Jerome and surrendered to the marshal in Jerome. And so he was incarcerated then in Jerome and sent to Prescott. And the charges were brought against him, and there was a court case that took place in Jerome. And of course he defended himself by saying that there was self-defense. He must have done a good job of it, because basically, even though he admitted shooting 3 people, he only got charged with 1 murder. A woman by the name of Mrs. Russell, which I haven't yet found which Russell they're talking about, because there's a number of Russells. in the family. So the jury then came back, and we have a newspaper article about it. Justin Head found guilty. And so he gets sent to the Arizona prison. Now, I thought that they would send him to Yuma, to that prison, and I think they did at the beginning. I'll have to go back to my notes. And but eventually he ended up in Florence, which is where the state prison is today. And so he spent some time. Now, before I continue with the story, is that also that Justin Head, for the time, that time and period, you would call a very educated man, because when the tribes were taken to San Carlos, the first thing was to annihilate Indian tribes and get them off the land. And then since that didn't work too good, then the next step was to get the Indians to become citizens modern citizens of the United States. And the plan was to take the children, and the way the Indians talked, they said, take the blanket away from them, which means take their culture away from them, and acculture them to the society. So boarding schools were started. One of the main ones was, of course, and I'm trying to remember the person's name that started the school, but in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, a former Army officer started a boarding school. And this boarding school is, of course, spawned one of the greatest Indian athletes or athletes of America, Jim Thorpe. But as I tracked Justin Head down, he went to school there and got there in 1884. And he was there till 1892. And according to the records, he accomplished education up through the 7th grade. Now, a lot of it was mostly not a lot of book learning, but a lot of menial work, like to be a carpenter. And I think he was one of the records says that he was trained to be a carpenter. So you could be a carpenter, plumber, electrician, or whatever. So anyway, he went up through the 7th grade, and so I was thinking that he must have been about 14 years old, so, or somewhere in that age group. He was born, from what I would say, probably after the tribes were taken to San Carlos. The tribes were taken to San Carlos in 1875. I would say he was born probably 1876. Put him there. And being there, he was educated, and I have volumes of letters he'd written while he was in prison that he was able to through his writings and all, and being in prison, and with the help, I believe, with a Jerome lawyer by the name of Rutherford, he got a parole. And there's a lot of communication back and forth, and he writes these letters. I also found that before he shot up everybody, there were 4 leaders from the Yavapai people that wanted their children to go to school. And this was in the Camp Verde area. And schools Indians couldn't go to school, children. So they went to the governor, and Justin Head was the interpreter for these leaders. And because of that, the governor, Goodwin, wrote a letter to the War Department, and that's how Mr. Taylor Gabbard, who was a Kentucky former legislator, came to the call and came to Camp Verde. And that's another story about how he helped the people there. So, he was well educated for that time, and so with the petitioning the governor and so forth, he got a parole on the condition that he leave the state and never come back. And so through the different communications then, he was accepted by the people at Carlisle Indian School, which he had gone to when he was younger, that they would take him back and he could go to school again, and in the summer times be able to work on farms back in Pennsylvania. And there's records about him working out there in the farms, mostly along with the Amish people. And he did that for years. So he never did come back to Arizona. He spent those years there, and finally he drifted away from that relationship through the Carlisle Indian School, and he kind of disappeared for a while. And then, lo and behold, one day, Steve came in and said, "Guess what? I found him again." And it was through the census records that in 1920, he shows up in Newark, New Jersey, and now he's married to a black woman. And that's where we lost a trail on Justin Head. But he did the murders, spent time in prison, got parole, asked with the parole conditions never to come back to Arizona, went to Pennsylvania, and stayed in existence at the Carlisle Indian School until he left it and ends up in New Jersey. And in the meantime, he was smart enough that he put in for a homestead in Clear Creek, which we were able to track down. He applied for a homestead in Clear Creek. So to me, that means that was his Apache side. And there is a clan that comes out of Clear Creek. And he must have belonged to that clan, because that's where he got his allotment. And of course, he never got to settle on it. He got it, the title came through. It was signed by, I have a copy of it, signed by Theodore Roosevelt, that this land was his, a deed. And then what happens then is, because you can't come back anymore, it becomes a battle on who's going to get it. And it ends up to his brother's side, who was George Beauty. Now, I don't know how he got the name Justin Head. Now, I know that when I was doing the research, he did work in Camp Verde. And, but he's listed as Justin Head in Carlisle, so my theory kind of died. I thought maybe he took the name Head because he worked for a guy named Boss Head, who was the forerunner of the Wingfield store in Camp Verde, the Sutler store. Boss Head ran the Sutler store, and Justin did work at the Sutler store, but it just doesn't work out that he got the name Head from Boss Head, because he was already known as Justin Head in Pennsylvania between 1894 and 1892. So it kind of blew my theory about how he got the name Head. But somehow his last name became Head, whereas his brother was named George Beauty. And there was a mass murder, and so these people that were killed, which I have a picture of here. Now, in the writings, especially the one that this picture here that comes from Charlotte Hall, it says that it was Camp Verde. But if you study the pictures and look at the background in this picture and in this picture, this is the Indian graveyard up there in the Clarkdale Palisades, behind where I live, up on top of the hill. So the 5 people that were murdered were buried up there. And in this picture you can see the coffins, and you can see the people and some Indian people that did the burying. Now, one article says that there's a character that was in Camp Verde, and I'm trying to say, George Hance, I think was his name. He's a justice of peace and so forth. He says that he conducted the service, well, we don't know for sure. And if it was done in Clarkdale, I don't think he had anything to do with it. But that, in a way, sometimes there's a lot of writings about Judge George Hance. Anyway, these are pictures of where these people are buried. And so today, if you take a ride up Palisades Roads, and then when you get to the first fork, turn right and just go on up the hill, there is a graveyard up there. And I believe the 5 that were murdered were buried there. And then also the people that died during the flu epidemic of 1918, the Spanish flu epidemic. There were people buried up there during that time also. So that is the story about the murders in Clarkdale. And it took place, according to this one article I have here, in November of 1906, right around the 1st of November.
You mentioned that he came into the camp, so they weren't living in houses.
They were living in wickiups at that time. There were very few what we would call houses, in my opinion, shacks. Didn't come into existence until later. At that time, they were still living in wickiups. And when I say camp, what it was a group of immediate family would live together. In other words, a man and his wife and then his children, whether they're married or not, then would live around him. So you would have, in this case, on top of that hill was a camp of beauties. I don't know how many people were there. I don't have that. And then next to them, there could be another camp of relatives, immediate relatives, living together. That's how.
Thank you.